All right, everyone. So we're getting into our second of three parts on Reconstruction and the New South. This is going to be um, hopefully again a little bit shorter than the ones from last week, uh, and this will be the second part of the notes for the chapter. We'll do the last part on the Monday that we get back, and then probably have the quiz then, unless something drastic happens and there's a big change. We'll probably have the quiz then over Reconstruction on Tuesday after Thanksgiving. So let's go ahead. Okay, so yesterday we talked about the death of Lincoln and the immediate aftermath of the Civil War and kind of Reconstruction and efforts associated with that. Today we're going to talk a little bit more about that and a little bit on the political side of Reconstruction here. So when we talk about radical Reconstruction, we're talking about the fact that the Reconstruction efforts were largely led early on by the radical Republicans. And again, these are the Republicans that really want to punish the South for the war. These are the ones that supported the Wade Davis bill and thought that the 10% plan of Lincoln didn't go far enough. So these folks really want to punish the South for the war. And you'll be able to notice that in some of the plans that they have, they're really taking efforts to make things hard uh, on the southern states for rejoining the Union. Okay, um, in the South, first off, you've got pushback. Okay, and while slavery is a racist institution, obviously, the real racism in the South, as we understand racism, is born out of the aftermath of the war, and particularly this starts with something called the Black Codes. Now, people often confuse the Black Codes with Jim Crow laws. Now, Jim Crow laws are primary. First of all, Jim Crow laws come along later on. Jim Crow laws are primarily meant to prevent African Americans from voting. Those would be things like literacy tests, um, grandfather clause, um, poll taxes, meaning taxes that you have to pay to be able to vote. So Jim Crow laws are primarily um, focused on preventing blacks to get the vote, and through literacy tests, through poll taxes, through grandfather clauses, stuff like that. The Black Codes were a little bit different. The Black Codes were more specific laws designed to keep African Americans down. Okay? Examples of Black Codes would be things like, let's see if I can write this a little bit better. I'm not even going to write them. Laws that say that blacks can't own land, that they can't own firearms or guns of any kind, that they can't hold public meetings in places. Uh, those are a few examples. So, that's the big difference between Black Codes and Jim Crow laws. Again, people in the South really look for reasons to limit opportunities for African Americans. Okay, so what the Black Codes basically do is they take the restrictions that were in place for slaves, not being able to own land, not being able to have public meetings, not being able to have firearms, and just make them laws to prevent now freedmen in the South. Okay, and they last for a short period of time until the federal government gets involved and overturns them. And that's where Jim Crow laws come into place. So that's kind of what we see happen there. One thing I want you to do, like you did with yesterday's video or the previous video, send me an email explaining the difference. And this is your question to answer. Explaining the difference between Black Codes and Jim Crow laws. So that is your question to answer for tomorrow or next time. So once you watch this video, just be sure and send me a response to that question. What is the difference between the Black Codes and Jim Crow laws? All right. So moving on to President Andrew Johnson. So Andrew Johnson is really a disagreeable man. I mentioned in the last video how he kind of wants to punish the South, people in the South a little bit who, were wealthy and people like that who, had some sense of superiority, and Johnson felt that they were better than him. So he makes it kind of hard on these people a little bit in the South, which is really not a good idea. Johnson also makes things really hard for the radical Republicans. Andrew Johnson loved to veto laws. In fact, he vetoed more bills than any other president before him. And he was only president for really ultimately less than 4 years, less than one full term in the White House. Not much less, but a little bit less. And he vetoed twice as many bills, or around twice as many bills in that time than Andrew Jackson did in his entire presidency. I think it was like 70 something. It was like 71 to 37 or something like that. I know Andrew Jackson vetoed like 37 bills, which had been the most, but of course he was president for 8 years. So Andrew Johnson just would not let anything pass through Congress, probably because, he was the guy in power and felt he had the power to do these things. This, of course, makes Johnson very much disliked by the radical Republicans and others as well. So they hatch a plan to ultimately to try to get rid of him, which I'll explain here shortly. Other aspects of Reconstruction that we see happen, of course, are more additions and changes to the Constitution. The first of which comes in the form of the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is probably, outside of the first 10 amendments and maybe a couple others, I guess women's suffrage and some other ones, is one of the most important amendments to the Constitution because it deals specifically with protecting the rights of citizens. So the language of the 14th Amendment basically does this. It grants citizenship to anybody born or naturalized in the United States. Okay? It grants citizenship to anybody born or naturalized in the United States. So anyone born in the U.S. or comes over here and can come over here and get citizenship, and they have full rights as citizens. It also gives due process, equal protection and due process under the law, which are really important as well, because the Equal Protection Clause and the Due Process Clause are a big part of Supreme Court rulings today. Probably this constitutional amendment is the one most referenced in Supreme Court rulings when we're talking about due process and equal protection. The Equal Protection Clause is a big deal. Now, interestingly enough, one part of the 14th Amendment, which has since changed, was it didn't apply to Native Americans, since they weren't considered citizens and they were kind of just people living their own life in America, just happened to be here basically like renting. They weren't actually included. So essentially, which makes the language of the 14th Amendment really interesting, is it promises equal protection under the law to anybody born or naturalized in the United States except Native Americans. So anybody born or naturalized in the United States except Native Americans, which I think is really an interesting and ironic twist to that. So that is the 14th Amendment. It's really, really important. And of course, we also get the 15th Amendment, which of course is really important as well. But it's a more specific amendment, so it doesn't have as much influence as the 14th. And it's the 15th Amendment that grants African American males the right to vote. More specifically, a person's right to vote should not be limited based on their race, ethnicity, or previous condition of servitude. In other words, African Americans can now vote. African American males. So it's a pretty big deal, pretty big changes to the Constitution. Good for everyone. Now, I mentioned before that because Johnson vetoes so many acts of Congress, and he just seems to find joy in doing that, eventually the radical Republicans push to impeach Andrew Johnson. Okay, and he becomes the first president to be impeached. He would later be joined by Bill Clinton and Donald Trump as the only three presidents ever to be impeached. People think Nixon was impeached Richard Nixon was not impeached. He resigned before he was before he probably would have been impeached. And unlike the other three, he would have been probably removed from office as well. But anyway, Johnson becomes the first president to be impeached. And he was kind of goaded in. Oops. Sorry about that. I didn't mean to move forward. I can't move back. So we'll just talk about that for a minute. So there was this thing called the Tenure of Office Act, which was written that basically said Johnson can't fire political officials and cabinet officials in particular without the approval of Congress. And they made that law specifically because they knew Johnson would violate it. So eventually he violates it by firing the Secretary of War, who he didn't get along with, Edwin Stanton, and that's how the impeachment proceedings started. Of the three presidents that have been impeached, Johnson was the closest to being removed. He was only spared by being removed from office by one vote. You need a 2/3 majority in the Senate to remove a president from the presidency, and they fell one vote short of removing him. They got 35, and they needed 36. So, sorry I moved ahead there, but we'll make it work. This is just a map of the states during Reconstruction. This was the black is the date that they were readmitted to the Union, and the orange is when they established a new conservative government in the South. So southern states, you see some took longer than others. Some went all the way to like 1876 to establish their new government. Some did it very quickly, like in Virginia. Okay, so the South in Reconstruction. One thing we quickly see happen is we see a lot of African Americans rise to important roles within the government. You would say, well, if the South is so racist and they have Jim Crow laws and poll taxes and stuff like that, how does this happen? Well, it's because the Army in the North basically goes down and occupies the South throughout the course of Reconstruction. And during that time, while these states are still trying to make their way back into the Union, a lot of the whites, obviously, particularly whites in the South, don't have their vote, aren't allowed to vote, don't have their rights of citizenship granted back to them. So this opens the door for African Americans to make their way into government. Most notably in that first election in 1868, Hiram Revels becomes the first African American in Congress. Now, there are others that made it that year, but history books say Hiram Revels was first, so we'll just say that. So Hiram Revels is the first African American to be elected to Congress, and obviously that's a big movement in a positive direction for race relations. Now, as these states get back in, and whites are able to start voting again once those rights are given back to them, we see a lot of these African Americans that get voted out of office, but still, it's an important moment. Another thing to note is in 1868, because Andrew Johnson's finished as president, he's not running for re-election, they call on Ulysses S. Grant to run for president. One interesting thing about history, if you understand your history, I always think it's interesting when certain people refer to Abraham Lincoln as like the greatest ever for blacks because he was the president that ended slavery, and that sort of thing. I know the current president mentions that sometimes. But the reality was back then in the 1860s, they didn't dislike Abraham Lincoln at all. They appreciated Abraham Lincoln. But the person that African Americans really looked at as their savior and hero, the person that did the most to end slavery, was Ulysses S. Grant, because he was the general in charge of the army that won the war, that gave them their freedom. So Ulysses S. Grant was beloved by African Americans. It was something like 95 or 96% of blacks voted for Ulysses S. Grant when he ran for president. So he was a beloved figure amongst African Americans, and he was the one really genuinely credited with giving them their freedom. Okay. So as I mentioned before, it's kind of weird in the South during Reconstruction because these states are occupied by the Union Army, kind of overseeing them and watching them and helping them kind of get back together so they can get to the point where they're readmitted to the Union. And this is what we call the Reconstruction governments. And the South will be down there really until 1870, the Army will be down there really more or less until 1877, when everything is kind of reestablished. Okay. Now there are two important terms that you hear from time to time in the AP, and in the AP, I'm going to give them to you, kind of combined as super important AP point number 15. First are scalawags. Scalawags are, it's kind of a pejorative term. It's kind of like a mean term used to make fun of African Americans. It's a term used to make fun of Republicans in the South, or anybody in the South that supports Reconstruction. So Southerners who support Reconstruction are referred to as scalawags, and they're genuinely hated by the people in the South. The other term that you hear a lot, which is the other part of the super important AP point here, is carpetbaggers. Carpetbaggers were Northerners who moved south to profit from Reconstruction. Okay, they're basically people looking for opportunity who maybe otherwise would have moved out west, but they feel like the South maybe offers them more opportunity. They tend to be middle-class people, doctors, lawyers, sometimes wealthier people as well, that see great opportunity for them in the South. These two groups of people generally were disliked by most Southerners. Scalawags, Southerners, primarily Southern Republicans who supported Reconstruction, they were looked at as traitors, and carpetbaggers were again looked down upon because they tried to take advantage of the circumstances in the South. So these are two groups of people generally disliked in the South. All right, so now that slavery is over, it doesn't mean that life is going to get infinitely better for people in the South, and there's going to be a lot of challenges that they have to deal with. Okay, for one, you have the issue of land ownership and tenant farmers. Okay, it's going to be very hard, obviously, even after the black codes are gotten rid of. It's going to be very hard for African Americans to own land. They have no money. They have very few skills. Now they're dealing with a social circumstance where they're not particularly well appreciated or liked, and they're stuck in these situations where land ownership is going to be almost an impossibility. So blacks are looking at their situation like, our only real opportunity is to leave, but we don't have any money, and where are we going to go? Okay, so one thing they often revert to is something called tenant farming, where they basically rent land on somebody's plantation and work that part of the land for the owner, basically for a living wage, basically for enough to get by. Maybe they use a little bit of that land to grow crops for subsistence farming, but very little opportunity for people here in the South. Okay. We also see this referred to as sharecropping. Sharecropping is exactly what it sounds like. A share of the crop goes to the landowner that you're renting the land from, and a share goes to you for doing the work. But depending on who the owner is, depending on whose land, whose plantation you're working, is really going to go a long way in determining how much you're going to actually get paid. Now, as you can imagine, these former slaves probably don't make a whole lot, which is certainly the case. But, occasionally you will find a good plantation owner who, for lack of a better term, for the most part takes care of the sharecroppers or the tenant farmers. Okay. Another thing to understand is, even though this is primarily circumstance that blacks had to face, sharecropping was also a white occupation as well. Whites in the South, plain folk who had little money and little opportunity, also sought out opportunities as tenant farmers and sharecroppers as well. So it wasn't entirely a profession for blacks. Um, Obviously, the next problem that former slaves have to deal with is they have very little income, if any, and they have nothing beforehand. So it's not like they have any money saved up, or it's not like they're going to get any money from a dead relative or anything like that. So that being the situation, from a banking perspective, credit is something very hard to get. So one thing you're going to find in the South, which exists today, because it's a system that's never totally made its way out of the South, is black poverty. You have a system of poverty in the South that's very hard to break out of, the cycle of poverty. And that's something I'll talk about later on this year when we get to the civil rights movement. But it's a very difficult circumstance, and it's a circumstance that makes it really hard for former slaves to break out of that and make any money for themselves. The book notes that more than half of the money made in crop in sharecropping and everything several years after the war, more than 50% of it is done by African Americans. But it's also important to note that there was a lot less money to be made at that time as the market started to weaken for cotton. So that became a problem for them as well. And this leads us to our final point of the day, something called the crop lien system. Okay, this affected whites as well, but it's primarily associated with blacks. And the crop lien system is something that existed in the South for a long time, really up through the 1960s, maybe even a little after that. And basically, with no money and little opportunity, blacks would go out and essentially buy land on credit. Okay, buy land on credit if they could get credit. Now, if you understand how banking works in credit, what credit basically means is you're taking a loan. Okay, and based on the level of risk that loan is going to determine what your interest rate is going to be. The higher the risk, the higher the interest rate, because the bank is making a leveraged decision to whether or not to loan you money, and the bank needs to make its money. So with no collateral, meaning they don't have anything to their name, with no money or anything like that, former slaves that fall victim to this crop lien system take out these loans with very high interest rates, sometimes between 50 and 60%. And when they take out these high interest rate loans, they're dependent on having a good season and having a good crop to be able to live off their wage and start to pay off the debt that they owe. Now, the problem with farming is sometimes it's really hard to do that because you have a season with no rain, or you have a bad harvest or something like that, and all of a sudden you're out a bunch of money because you can't take any crops to be sold. Okay. On the flip side of that, if you have a few bad seasons in a row, you could totally be broken. And this affected whites as well. But it creates this system of persistent black poverty in the South that a century later, African Americans in the South are still forced to deal with. So the crop lien system was a very predatory loan system in the South that affected them and their ability to move out of poverty and provide opportunities for themselves. So I hope that all made sense. I again went on a little bit longer than I thought I would, but that's what I do. So anyway, I hope everybody has a wonderful Thanksgiving, and certainly email me with any questions and a response to the one question that I posed earlier. All right, have a great Thanksgiving, everyone. See you.